So this is going to be a speech about America, but I'm actually going to start with a quote from the founder of Dubai. Here's what he said. My father rode a camel. I ride a Mercedes. My son rides a Land Rover. My grandson is going to ride a Land Rover. But my great-grandson is going to have to ride a camel again. Strong men create easy times. Easy times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. He might be the founder of Dubai, but he may as well have been speaking to my generation of Americans. You see, when our nation was born in 1776, we were a nation of insurgents. Our founding fathers stood up to the most powerful empire in the world, declared their independence, and then somehow turned assertion into reality. They were a band of rebels who defeated the reigning incumbent of their era, who went on to become just another small nation on the other side of an ocean. But eventually, the insurgent becomes the incumbent. The underdog becomes the favorite. And the new incumbent starts to apologize for its own success instead of working even harder to create even more of it. And eventually, that incumbent gets unseated by a new insurgent on the other side of a different ocean. It's happening today. Personally, I think that's what many of us sensed when we rallied behind the cry to make America great again several years ago. But here's what we missed. In order to know the story of how we make America great again, we have to first remember the story of what made America great the first time around. That is the story of our nation's history. It's a story we've utterly forgotten, and I'm not going to do justice to it in these 10 minutes that I have on this stage. But what I will do in these few short minutes that we have is to shine a light on one aspect of our founding culture that I think we've abandoned in recent years, that's actually personally really important to me as an individual, and it has nothing to do with politics. It's the death of intellectual curiosity in America. If you think about who are the most groundbreaking intellectual thinkers of the 18th century, you know what? They actually weren't our founding fathers. Most of them were on the other side of the Atlantic. They were the likes of John Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, who led the way in philosophy, Newton and Leibniz, who led the way in math and physics, Adam Smith and David Hume in economics and psychology. But the thing that distinguished our founding fathers wasn't their genius in any one of those disciplines. They weren't mathematical or philosophical savants. They just learned from the people who actually were. The thing that really distinguished our founding fathers was their ability to combine those intellectual foundations with a vision for the future that didn't exist in the old world. You see, minds like Locke and Leibniz and Newton, they were hands down brilliant. But the European society into which they were born, the European society in which they lived, they were fundamentally different from ours in a different way. They valued expertise over curiosity. They stayed in their lanes. The people who were supposed to run the government ran the government. The people who were supposed to philosophize about the government ended up philosophizing about the government. But they weren't the same people. You see, the old world was fundamentally reluctant to break down boundaries. Boundaries, they thought, existed for a reason. The ruling class existed to rule. The expert class existed to advise them. But our founding fathers, they were different. They didn't believe in those boundaries. They didn't even really believe in the necessity of expertise. For example, y'all surely know that Benjamin Franklin was one of the co-authors of our Declaration of Independence. He was a polymath genius of a Renaissance man who, in addition to founding universities and hospitals, was also a prolific author. He dabbled in medicine. He discovered a treatment to the common cold. He was a creator of musical instruments, one of which went on to actually be used by Mozart and Beethoven. Some of his devices were incredibly practical. The lightning rod for the home, actually the bifocal glasses that you wear to read, a Franklin stove, a tool that he used to heat food in the house, but it was also a major breakthrough in the field of thermodynamics. He was the archetype of the 18th century Renaissance man. I think most of you know that. But here's the remarkable part. He wasn't actually an exception. He was an embodiment of the norm of his era. Take two of his lesser-known co-signatories of the Declaration of Independence. Robert Livingston designed the steamship. It's a fundamental building block of the Industrial Revolution as a side project while serving as an ambassador to France. Roger Sherman was a self-educated attorney who never actually went to law school, somebody who had no formal education. Forget Harvard and Yale, Pete was just talking about it. He didn't care about the titles. He educated himself, became an attorney, and he also wanted to make sure that the next generation of Americans would have an access to an education that he didn't actually get. That's why he went on to serve on the governing body of Yale. And of course, there's the two most famous signatories of that document, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who together formed one of the greatest intellectual rivalries in all of human history. Thomas Jefferson was actually, you know him as our third president. He was actually more of a scientist guy. He was a scientifically curious guy. John Adams was more the humanities guy. But they were each deeply curious about the home turf of the other guy. And they were unafraid to compete with a true intellectual heavyweight on their own turf. It's true that John Adams, he studied politics and war, but he also studied math and philosophy and poetry and Greek and Latin. And in fact, a little-known fact about John Adams is that after he left the White House, he actually went on to read sacred Hindu texts. I say this as a Hindu-American myself. He probably knew more about these texts than I do today. He actually wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson saying that if he was going to live his life again, he'd be a Sanskrit scholar first. These guys were lifelong learners. And by the way, so was his nemesis, Thomas Jefferson. This was a guy who was fluent in 5 languages, capable of reading 2 more. Over the course of his life, he wrote 16,000 letters. Now, if you're a high school student hearing this, I think I know what you're thinking. You know, 16,000 letters, that's like 4,000 words, that's like 5 pages double-spaced on my computer. No, I don't mean 16,000 letters of the alphabet. I mean, he wrote 16,000 essays handwritten, sitting in an uncomfortable chair while he did it. And you might wonder if it might have been a little uncomfortable for him to sit in that chair for so long. Well, it turns out he solved that problem by also inventing the polygraph and actually inventing the swivel chair, which he used to sit on while he wrote the Declaration of Independence. In fact, we're here in Virginia today. He also managed to be an architect in his spare time. The state capitol and the dome that sits in Richmond today was designed by Thomas Jefferson a couple centuries and a half ago. There was something in the water back then, something in the culture. It was a culture that valued education. It valued autodidacts, people who could teach themselves. It valued a fundamental curiosity about how the world works, a desire to explore it, and an unyielding confidence that even if you weren't an expert in something, you could still figure it out with the right combination of self-education and curiosity. That's what distinguished our country, because compared to nations like France and England, it's true that America was actually really provincial at that time. We were nothing more than a backwater cluster of a bunch of small towns scattered along an eastern seaboard. Economically, militarily, geopolitically, we were destined to be nothing more than a footnote in global history. But the people who those footnotes would have been written about, they were actually deeply curious about the world they inhabited, about the history to which they contributed. And they were deeply confident in their ability to change every part of it for the better. And that's exactly what they did. So what's the message for us today? I think we need to revive that special combination of curiosity and confidence. I think we want to be a country of people who, yes, tinker in their garages, who, yes, write a long essay in the evening after working at an insurance company during the day. We should expect more of one another as citizens. We should expect more of ourselves as citizens. We should expect more of our leaders as citizens. Back then, the presidents who left the White House went on to become scholars of Sanskrit. Today, they sign Netflix deals and go play around at golf. It's easy to say, how cool were our founding fathers, and then go back to the daily drudgery of our modern technocracy. But I ask the question of why we can't, too, be a little bit more like our founding fathers. We political conservatives, we talk a lot about staying true to the political and legal principles of the Constitution, and there's no doubt that's important. But I also think we should be inspired to stay true to the founding culture, that founding culture of exploration, of irreverence, of curiosity. And the irony is it should be a lot easier for us to do that today than it was for them back then. For starters, the main language of scholarship back then wasn't English. It was French and Latin. So you had to learn French and Latin to be able to access the scholarship. And it would take you weeks, if not months, to get your hands on a copy of a book that you wanted to read. Today, almost everything is available in the language you want it. 2 strokes of an iPhone away from getting any book you want to read it. The only thing stopping us is our own incuriosity and our own veneration of somebody else's expertise and our own lack of confidence to build our own. You might expect that our founding fathers didn't have the time, didn't have the luxury to afford the intellectual curiosity that they harbored. They were struggling for their own survival against an empire on the other side of an ocean. But actually, it turns out the opposite was true. The culture of England was fundamentally less curious and less confident at its core. That's why we won. That's why they lost. That's why we have been at the forefront of the 20th century. That's why they've been in decline in the 250 years since then. It's why we went on to become the greatest nation in modern history. That special sauce that allowed America to succeed was our founding fathers' unique brew of curiosity combined with confidence. And it wasn't just a matter of self-indulgence. It was because they wanted to build a world around them that was better than the one they found. It wasn't just to get drunk on their own curiosity. It's because they strived to make America, their nation, a better nation. It was a desire to create a thriving nation that would outlive them, and thrive that nation did. They made our nation a magnet for minds just like them, that were just as curious and just as courageous as themselves. One of my favorite stories about one of those minds we attracted was that of Joseph Priestley. He was actually an 18th century chemist. He was a British guy. He was probably one of the top 3 chemists in Europe. Some people would argue he was even the top chemist in Europe at his time. But he had some unusual religious beliefs that defied the beliefs of the Anglican Church. So it actually became unsafe for him to remain in England. So what did he do? He moved to Pennsylvania, where he was welcomed by the likes of Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. It might have been the first notable example of a brilliant scientist moving to America precisely because we were a free society, a tradition that so many others in the centuries that followed, including my own parents, later followed in coming to this country. They came here for the same reason that Joseph Priestley did, because we're a free society where creative people are able to pursue their dreams however they see fit. Priestley didn't come to America because we had great universities back then, because we had funding for his research back then. In fact, we had neither of those things at the scale we do today. He came here for one reason. It's because we had freedom. Freedom to explore ideas without fear of being locked up. Freedom to be himself, including the freedom to discover who he even was. That's the unspoken part of the American dream. Not just the freedom to achieve whatever you want, but even more importantly, the freedom to discover what it is you want to achieve. And it's precisely at this moment in our history, when we stopped being insurgents and started becoming incumbents, that we ourselves lost that sense of curiosity, that we lost that sense of confidence. And if we don't change course, pretty soon we're going to become that incumbent that gets unseated by another backwater nation on the other side of a different ocean. The way for us to remain a magnet for those curious people, for those ambitious people around the world, is by cultivating the culture that drew Joseph Priestley here, the same culture that drew my own parents here, a culture that prizes free and open debate and speech and inquiry, a culture that doesn't force a monolithic dogma upon everyone, a culture that doesn't force you to bow down to what a politically appointed expert says on a given day, but instead gives you the latitude to question dogmas in the pursuit of truth. You see, that's the greatest thing our founding fathers actually invented. It wasn't a lightning rod. It wasn't a stove. It was a country that offered its citizens freedom of thought. The greatest invention that produced so many others that followed it. That's the invention we risk losing in a country that focuses on suppressing dissent instead of fostering creativity. Can we sustain that special combination of curiosity and confidence? I think that is the defining question for our era. And the answer starts with how we educate our next generation. There will be those who object to this vision as the exclusive North Star for educating our children. They'll say it's not enough for our schools and our universities to teach kids to be intellectually curious, to be courageous, to be confident, but that we must also teach them to be socially just and to rectify the injustices created by the likes of our founding fathers, who blindly pursued Enlightenment values while actually failing to abide by the values that they preached. I'd actually argue the opposite. I think that intellectual curiosity and courage, combined with a willingness to transcend boundaries that go beyond your preordained area of expertise, beyond your own lane, is actually one of the most important building blocks of empathy. And I think empathy is the most important building block of a just society. And that's the most important gift that our founding fathers left for their children. The gift of empathy that comes from the courage to transcend the boundaries that society deals you. The first president of the United States who wasn't one of our founding fathers to serve in the White House was actually the son of John Adams. It was John Quincy Adams, and boy, did he learn a lot from his abolitionist father, the second president. John Quincy Adams, he was a legendary Secretary of State. He actually wasn't that great of a president by most measures. But he knew it too, and he felt his service to this country wasn't quite done at the time he left the White House. He struggled in his soul. He struggled with how he was going to complete his service to this country with a presidency that didn't live up to his expectations. He thought he would write and publish. That didn't quite do it for him. So he did something that no president who had left the White House went back to do ever since then. He went back to Congress. He became a lone congressman after serving as the president of the United States, and he went back to Congress with one aim: to abolish slavery, to carry out the legacy and vision of his father that his father wasn't quite able to effectuate as the second president of our nation. There's a problem with this, though, is that there was actually a rule in Congress that prevented you from debating slavery on the Congress floor. The South didn't want to debate it. You want to talk about cancel culture in the Democratic Party of 2022? Cancel culture in the Democratic Party of 1833 was a lot worse. They wouldn't let you say the word slavery on the Congress floor because the South didn't want to debate it. But here's a guy who had already been president of the United States. He had nothing to lose. So what did he do? He said the word slavery, slavery, slavery on the Congress floor, as many times as it took for him to get censured for it. And then he uses his trial in the House to get kicked out of Congress morning to night to make the case for abolition. And morning to night he did, and by the end of that trial, they had decided to get rid of the gag rule altogether. This is a guy who continued to serve in his career as a congressman all the way up to the point where he was giving a speech on the Congress floor when he had a stroke. They kept him alive in the anteroom chamber for another 2 days before he died in that Capitol building where he served. They had to ask for volunteers amongst his fellow congressmen for who would lead his funeral rites. And who stepped up other than a little-known first-term congressman of that time by the name of Abraham Lincoln. These are the stories of American history. That's the story of American exceptionalism. That's the story of American empathy. That's what we need to be teaching our kids in the classroom. That's what we need to be reviving in our education. It's what we're going to need to revive in our culture if we're going to remain a nation of insurgents rather than a nation of incumbents. Thank you very much, and appreciate your time today. Thank you.